I wanted to bring this photo to you. Raise your hand if you're familiar with it. Yeah, it's a photo of Aisha Evans, who went to Baton Rouge to stand with other nonviolent protesters in the light of Anton Sterling's murder. And it's such a powerful image, how she stands there peacefully and strong and resolute, and these armed men in riot gear back away from her and her power. Gandhi would call this SoulForce, SoulForce. And today I want to talk to you about this SoulForce, this non-violent spiritual means of effecting change and striving for liberation. And the reason why we do this is because Reverend John and I agree with Martin Luther King Jr. that nonviolence is a practice by which we create the beloved community. And that is what we're striving to do here together. So what is this nonviolence? How does it work? What is it? Why do we do it? There's a lot one could say on that topic. Gene Sharp, who has received numerous nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize based on his most thorough documenting of nonviolent strategies for change, Sharp documented 198 of them, which would be a really long list to share with you, even across many Sundays. But each of those tactics is based on a singular principle. And that principle is the withdrawal of consent to participation in oppressive or violent systems. The withdrawal of consent to participate in violent or oppressive systems. This is the premise that Sharp lifts up, that Gandhi lifts up, that Martin Luther King lifts up, that Cesar Chavez lifts up, that nonviolent activism across the world has utilized. We see a very famous example in the Montgomery bus boycott, where the participants, the Black participants in Montgomery, refused, i.e. no longer consented to ride on a bus if they were going to be treated to the indignity of being treated like second-class citizens. And so they said, we're going to withdraw our consent. And instead, they said, you know, we might not control the bus system. We might not be in elected office. We might not have the commissioner of the public transportation system on our side or in agreement with us, but we do have something else. We have feet, and we have organizing power, and a few of us have cars, and if we stick together, we can be free. And they said, we will not come back to riding that bus system until we have the same status as passengers as everyone else. It was highly effective. It's one of those movements where we lift up how non-participation can apply pressure for change. Now, King could have selected a different option. There were other activists who were proposing proposing more violent or confrontational tactics to end segregation and other racist practices in the United States. But King was really clear on 4 reasons why nonviolent movement building was essential. The first one that Gandhi recognized in his context in South Africa and then in India too, was that the violent forces arrayed against them were extremely powerful. Lots of people, lots of guns, lots of armored vehicles, hoses, police dogs, and other military hardware that we know of. And King said, if we pursue a violent means towards liberation, that he believed that the violent response would be annihilating. He would lose too many people he cared about. too many teachers and too many doctors and too many neighbors and too many children. He said we can't put our people at risk that way. The second reason was, he said, when you look at history, violent movements towards liberation have not increased funding to anti-poverty programs. We need food and housing and schools. We need to address the violence of poverty in our midst. And nonviolence is much more successful at achieving funding for those goals. The third part was, he said, violent resistance does not speak to the conscience of the white power majority. And we're seeking to change hearts and minds as well as systems. And the fourth one was really important. And he said, if we are violent, we will become the very thing we are trying to destroy. We will become violent within ourselves, and perhaps violent within our own communities. And the last part about wanting not to become that which one fears and hates is really important. In his work, Gandhi points out that satyagraha, this SoulForce, this organizing for change, was not just about a purity of means. It was not just about a purity of ends. It was about a purity of the practitioner. Gandhi did so much work in his own personal life to be able to be a nonviolent activist. What does this look like? He studied religious texts and religious leaders, both of Hinduism, but of Christianity and other traditions. He would pray regularly every day. He would meditate to find the grounding within. He would practice vegetarianism to give himself ethical alignment in even how he ate. And in each of these, one of the things that I noticed as a kind of thorough strain was that he was building his willpower. He understood that human beings had instinct, that we reacted, we have a reactionary impulse, but he also understood that we had willpower, an ability to choose. And so he would grow his ability to choose as well as his ability to endure. An example of this that I found really interesting and compelling was his wife had a health issue and she needed to give up salt in her diet. And she really didn't want to do this. And she said, you couldn't do it either. I mean, doesn't salt make everything taste a little better? And he goes, I can. In fact, I will give it up for 1 year. And she goes, no, you don't need to give it up. I'll do it. You don't need to give it up. And he said, I made a vow. Right in front of you, I made a vow and I'll give it up for a year. Instead, he gave it up for 10 years. Because he was teaching himself that he had a will to determine how he would move in the world. And so today, we're going to consider some of the practices that help us grow our will, from music that moves us, to prayers like the one Reverend John just offered to center us, to practices of seeing the humanity of another so we can grow in nonviolence ourselves. Let us welcome those practices within us and within this community this morning.
A few weeks ago, I attended an after-hour session on enemy images. Is that better? Yes, okay. A few weeks ago, I attended an after-hour session on enemy images. Participants started off sharing their views on conflict. A few people noted that conflict is necessary for growth and evolution. Reflecting on that, I noted that many of us at UUCA are uncomfortable with conflict, in particular white folks, and I'm included in that. Many of us look for a prescribed process of resolution in policies and rules. So I want to share with you this morning a different type of strategy for dealing with conflict, which Reverend Anastasia presented during the after hour. She presented one of many models on conflict escalation. This one depicted 3 stages. At the 2 lower levels, the parties were able to work in some way to resolve their disagreements. However, at the highest level, the parties are so entrenched in their positions that resolution is difficult, if not impossible. She then proposed that when we find ourselves at the top level with other people, we have created an enemy image. If we want to engage with the other party and have a chance at a productive outcome, we need to reframe our orientation towards them. And I want to underscore that she invited those who were not ready to engage with other people to remain at the highest level if they wished. For those who were ready, she then ran us through a brief exercise with pencil and paper. And I'm simplifying here in the interest of time. First, envision your enemy image. Draw a circle on your paper and write down the thoughts that come to mind when you envision them. Mine were, of course, overwhelmingly negative. Then she asked us to consider our feelings and write them down and consider how they manifested in our bodies. And my feelings were sadness and hopelessness, and my body felt really restricted, and my breathing was shallow, and my eyes were narrow. She then invited us to think about other things we know about the person. Anything. Didn't have to be positive. Could be their birthday, their hair color, their profession. For me, this exercise started me off thinking about neutral characteristics and naturally led to me thinking of their positive traits. And as I started to do this, I cracked a smile. And I felt a release of the tension I was holding when I was focusing on the other enemy image that I had of the person. She then asked us to write down our feelings, and for me, they had changed markedly. I was much more open and appreciative. In closing, Reverend Anastasia suggested that when we create an enemy image, we put a mask over the other person. She suggested that we could do this exercise to try to change that image if we wished before engaging with them. And we might do it several times. I really appreciated being able to do this learning with other church members as a combined virtual and in-person group. It reminded me of how our human brains are so full of bias and limit our ability to see the whole of any one person or situation. And it gave me a concrete tool to combat my bias and shake my resentment. This felt like spiritual work for me, opening, creating possibility for positive engagement, and inviting me and empowering me to lean into conflict in a different way.
Pause and reflect. Breathe and release. Repair your universe and restore all your heart's worth, and proceed to be, and proceed to heal the world. Pause and reflect. Pause and reflect. Breathe
I hope what I shared earlier helps you get a sense of how nonviolence is strategic and effective, and that you're starting to understand that it's spiritual work as well. One of the things in my life that I have been thinking about in preparation for this sermon is why I so fundamentally and fully believe in nonviolence, and particularly how love for oneself and one's dignity, but also a love that you offer the one who is oppressing you or who's violent or who you're confronting, how love for them is also so critical. King says you need to have a kind of agape love, which can be a whole sermon in itself, but it's the highest and most spiritual form of love. And it's love not just because they're your family member or your friend or your parent or your lover. Those loves we're familiar with. It's a love that respects life so much and understands that life is part of the divinity of isness that is all around us. And it's embracing that and bringing that into the center of your being. I recognize that the reason why I believe that agape love can be this type of soul force. Let's give a minute to. Are we good? That agape love can be a type of soul force is because I experienced this myself, particularly as a child. When I was young, I lived mostly alone with my mother, but I had 3 older siblings. My oldest brother was 11 years older than me, and so when I was growing up in elementary school, he was actually back home from college. That was the age gap. And then my older siblings' sisters went to boarding school, and so they weren't in the home. And by this point, my father had left. So it was just me and my mom, and then sometimes my brother when he would come home and live with us. And I loved my brother. I loved him a lot, in part because he was a big mentor who taught me poetry and took me to museums and would show me kind of this charismatic world. And I loved my mother because she was my mother, and she would feed me and live with me, and we would cuddle in bed at night. But the truth about my brother is he was a violent man. And he would regularly abuse my mother. And over silly things, right? Like she took a phone message down but didn't tell him right when he came in the door. And when he would attack her, and I was young in elementary school, I knew this love that I had for my mother and my brother and the love that they had for me, and I would put my little 85-year-old pound body between them. And he would stop because I would shine that kind of agape love right back at him. Now, I would have thought maybe that was just me. Maybe that's nothing to put faith in. But one day when I was in middle school, I was walking down my street, and there were some big apartment buildings at the end of my block. And one of them had these steps out in front, and a whole group of about 20 people were gathered around those steps. And I was like, what's going on? What's so interesting on these steps? And so I joined the crowd that was getting larger and larger. And there was this young man who was threatening what I think was his girlfriend, saying unkind and hurtful and demeaning things about her, and occasionally raising his fist to hit her. And every time he would raise his fist, the crowd would go, and he'd hear that sound, and he'd lower and step away. But it was occurring again and again, until one time, after this had gone on for a little bit, this person who I think might have been his mother, but was maybe just a neighbor, went up to him as he raised his fist one last time, and she said, "That's enough. That's enough." And it was like all the hate and rage poured out of him, and he became soft and released. And he went in the building, and the woman went away with a friend, and this crowd gathered. The crowds that had gathered dispersed. And I realized then something that Gandhi said. He said in his training of activists in Satyagraha, SoulForce work, that there were two things that you needed to teach people. One was to give up fear. And I realized, and he said fear was the easier thing to give up. He said, you have to give up fear. And I realized that we are conditioned to fear certain people. When then you're outside of the system, the people that someone intimately connected to that violence or system would fear, someone outside of it doesn't. And so when I would see other confrontations on the street, I began to recognize I could move forward without fear and help diffuse them. My street had a lot of action, clearly. Very nice street, trees and all of that. But the thing that was harder to teach them was to view the humanity of the person you're in conflict with. So hard to do that. That's why Gwen's exercise is really fundamental. How can you see the humanity in another? Sorry, I lose my focus. So the humanity in another can happen through an exercise like Gwen's, or because, like I with my brother, I knew more sides of him. Or it could be because you're disciplined and trained in it, and you do the prayers that Gandhi would do, or the community meetings and the sermons that King would give to his community, to make sure that you recognized, no matter where you were in the conflict, it was between human beings. And one of the things that Gandhi really emphasized was that when you could see the others as human beings with will and agency, you didn't seek to coerce them to your side. You did not coerce them to your side. You invited them in. You gave them a choice about which way to go. In a basic level, since we're talking about nonviolence not just in big social movements, but also in small ways, the best definition of being non-coercive that I know is, if you're asking someone to do something, if they're not allowed to say no, it's not an invitation. If you're asking them to do something and they're not allowed to say no, there's an element of coercion in there. So I think about that. Actually, every time I ask someone to volunteer in church, I want you to know that I have prepared myself that you will say no. And I respect you when you do. So try for yes more often than no. I want to close with a story that kind of ties a lot of these things together. In 1964, Black activists in Mississippi, Alabama, realized that they weren't making the progress that they wanted to see happen for their state, particularly when it came to democracy building. And in part, this was because the law did not protect their Black bodies. And so they wanted to invite people from the North, mostly white college students, but also college students of color, to come and hopefully bring the law and the media attention with them, in hopes that then collectively they could achieve some ends. And so in the summer of 1964, about 300 college students from the North gathered in Oxville, Ohio. for several days of training. They learned songs to sing together to bolster their sense of hope and solidarity. They learned to pray and to ground themselves. They learned how to respond nonviolently when someone hit them or pushed them or beat them. And they were told, if you can't respond nonviolently, it's too dangerous for us for you to go. Because if you respond violently, the brother or sister or sibling next to you will also be attacked. And we're trying to keep our own people safe. And they learn to respect and see their oppressive forces, the policemen, as human beings. And they felt ready to go. One of the people there was a professor that I've studied with, Marshall Gans. He was a 20-year-old who was a junior in Harvard. And he had gone because his father was a rabbi and a chaplain in the army during World War II. And they stayed in Germany in the years after. And Marshall remembers his 5th birthday party. They were celebrating in this camp that he lived with, this camp. And he was like, why are there only German Jewish kids in this camp? He didn't understand as a 5-year-old, but he knew as a 5-year-old it was really great to give these other kids birthday presents. He thought that was really fun. But he recognized as he kind of came of age how his family told him that the Holocaust wasn't just about anti-Semitism, it was also about racism, and how his family taught them to be on the side of those who were with people in that struggle. And that's why he went to join the Mississippi Summer Project. But the day before the training end, the great Bob Moses, the lead organizer for the Mississippi Summer Project, who just passed a few weeks ago, stood up and shared that 3 of their party, Andrew Goodwin, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, had vanished. They didn't know exactly what happened, but they all expected that they were killed, which they had been. And Bob Moses, in his gentle voice, said, I wish I could tell you to just go home, but I have to ask that you come with us to make a difference. If you choose to go home, there's no shame in it. But I ask that you think about why you came and if you could continue with us. And there was silence amongst those 300 people, and Marshall sank a little lower in his chair because it had gotten real in a new way. And then from the crowd of 300, Gene Wheeler rose and began to sing.
They say freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. They say freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, I've struggled so long. We must be free.
And as she sang that, she left the auditorium, and all 300 rose and filed out after her, and all 300 got on the bus the next day to go to Mississippi. My dear ones, each and every day we can make a choice for nonviolence, a choice to center nonviolence in our spiritual lives, a choice to build up the will and fortitude to make the nonviolent choice when we're in a time of conflict or struggle, the choice about whether we are going to consent or not consent to relationships that we find abusive or that degrade our dignity, whether or not we're going to join nonviolent movements to push for social change. What is the next choice for nonviolence that you wish to begin or grow in your life? May we do this work individually and collectively as it leads us to the beloved community. Amen.